This story will help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Where are you listening from? Drop it in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and let's drift into peaceful dreams. The clock struck midnight. Outside, the rain hammered against the windows in violent sheets, as if the sky itself was trying to erase something. Inside, the dim light of the chandelier flickered, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Diana paced the room, the sharp click of her heels cutting through the silence. She glanced at the door. No sign of him. Her pulse quickened. "He's not coming," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. Her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the edge of the desk, where a single manila envelope lay, its contents sealed tightly. Across the room, Leo stood by the window, staring out into the storm, his expression unreadable. "You really think he'll show?" His voice was cool, but his jaw tightened as though he was bracing himself for something. Diana's eyes narrowed. "I don't know, but we can't wait much longer. If we don't..." The door creaked open. Both heads snapped toward the sound. It was him, Julian, but his face, his eyes, were not what they should have been. The calm facade he usually wore was gone. In its place was something raw, something darker. He stepped inside slowly, as though every movement was measured, calculated. "You're late," Diana said, her tone colder than she intended. Julian didn't reply immediately. His eyes flickered toward the envelope on the desk, then back to her. "I'm sorry," he said, the words heavy with something unsaid. Leo moved closer, the tension in his posture growing palpable. "What's going on, Julian?" We agreed. "We don't have time for your questions, Leo." Julian's voice was sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. "I need you both to listen carefully." Diana stepped forward. "What's happening?" "You're scaring me." Julian's gaze shifted to the envelope, and his fingers twitched at his side. He swallowed hard, and then, as if making a decision, he moved toward it. But before he could touch it, the lights flickered again, this time going out entirely. A deep, suffocating silence descended. Then came the sound, the faintest of whispers, barely audible over the roar of the rain. "I know what's in that envelope," a voice hissed from the shadows. Diana's breath caught in her throat. Leo spun, his eyes darting around the room. But there was no one but them. "Who's there?" Leo's voice was barely a whisper, a warning. The whisper came again, this time closer. "It's too late to stop it now." Julian's face went pale. His hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, and the faint metallic clink of something concealed beneath it echoed through the room. Diana's heart raced. She couldn't look away. "Do not open that envelope," Julian said, his voice now strained. Diana's mind raced. Every instinct told her to pull away, to back out of whatever this was, but her curiosity, her need for answers, kept her standing there, frozen. A sudden loud crash of thunder shook the walls, and when the lights flickered back on, Julian was gone. Just gone. The door was still closed. The only sign that anyone had been there was the now empty space where Julian had been standing. The envelope lay on the desk, untouched. Diana slowly reached for it, but Leo grabbed her wrist. "Don't, Leo, we need to know what's in it," she whispered. Her fingers were already trembling, her grip tightening on the edge of the desk. "We have no choice." Leo's eyes narrowed. What did he mean? Why did he leave like that? What did he know? Diana's thoughts swirled. She was certain Julian hadn't left on his own accord. But that wasn't the biggest mystery. The biggest mystery was what was inside the envelope, and why it had made Julian run. With shaking hands, Diana ripped it open. The paper inside wasn't a letter, but a map of the old mansion that stood on the outskirts of town. And there, in the middle, in bold red ink, were the words, "The vanishing hour is upon us." The clock struck again, and this time, it wasn't midnight. Diana's hands trembled as she held the map up to the dim light. The ink was fresh, but there was no telling how long it had been there, how long Julian had known about it. The edges of the map were frayed, worn from years of neglect. Her eyes traced the lines, every curve, every marking. The mansion was there, its sprawling grounds, hidden corners, and forgotten rooms. But it was the mark on the map that caught her attention, the center of the mansion, where a large X was drawn. Leo's breath was heavy as he leaned in closer. What is this? Why would Julian give you this now? And why would he leave like that? I don't know, Diana whispered, her voice distant, lost in the mystery that was unfolding around her. The map felt like a puzzle, the pieces just out of reach. She wanted to throw it away, to burn it and forget it ever existed, but the gnawing sense of dread in her gut wouldn't let her. There was something more to this, something deeper than they could see. And now, whatever Julian had warned them about was only growing closer. Leo backed away, his footsteps quick as he paced the room. This doesn't make sense. Julian knows something. He wouldn't have come here if he didn't. And why the hell did he leave that behind? Diana stood still, staring at the map. The flickering chandelier cast fleeting shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller, suffocating. The tension between them thickened with every passing second. They both knew they had to go to the mansion. They had to understand what was happening. But something held them back. What if we don't? She asked, her voice barely audible. What if it's worse than we think? Leo's face tightened. He stopped pacing and met her gaze. If we don't, we'll never know. We'll never know what Julian was running from, what that map means, what's happening. The room seemed to close in on them. The storm outside raged louder, as if it were trying to drown out their thoughts. Diana's gaze flicked to the window, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye, a shadow, just outside the glass. Her heart skipped a beat, but when she turned her head, there was nothing there. We're running out of time, Leo said, his voice low urgent. He grabbed her wrist gently, pulling her back from the desk. Let's go. Now. She nodded, but something lingered in the air. Something cold, a feeling that no matter how fast they moved, they were always a step behind whatever was unfolding. They grabbed their coats and stepped outside into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. The rain had let up, but the sky remained heavy with dark clouds. The mansion wasn't far, just a few miles down the road. It loomed at the edge of the town, abandoned for years. People spoke of it in whispers, of strange lights and sounds, of the mysterious figures seen in the windows. No one went near it, but tonight, that's exactly where they were headed. The drive was silent, the only sound the tires skimming over the wet pavement. Diana could feel the weight of the map pressing against her in her coat pocket, as if it were alive, watching her. Leo's eyes were focused on the road, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the wheel. When they reached the mansion, the moon barely broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the front lawn. The house stood before them like a dark, looming presence, its windows boarded up, the once grand entrance now crumbling. The air felt colder, heavier, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Diana hesitated for just a moment, a fleeting doubt crossing her mind. But Leo was already out of the car, walking toward the front door. His silhouette blended into the darkness, his figure swallowed up by the shadows of the mansion. Leo, she called, her voice catching in the stillness. He turned, his face lit by the faint glow of the moonlight. We don't have time to waste. Let's go. Diana took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart, and followed him up the cracked steps. The door creaked as Leo pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The inside was as forgotten as the outside, dusty, decaying, and silent. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. The faintest creak of floorboards echoed through the halls, but there was no one there. No sounds other than their own breath, no signs of life. This place gives me the creeps, Diana muttered, but her words felt hollow in the empty space. Leo didn't answer. He was already moving toward the grand staircase that led up to the second floor. His eyes were scanning every inch of the room, alert, suspicious. At the top of the stairs, they paused. There were 3 doors, one to the left, one straight ahead, and one to the right. The map had given no indication of where to go, but Diana felt drawn to the door on the left. It was slightly ajar, as if waiting for them to open it. Leo noticed her hesitation. What is it? I don't know, Diana said, her voice barely above a whisper. but something feels wrong. Without another word, Leo pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was shrouded in darkness, save for a single, faint light coming from a small crack in the wall. Diana felt her pulse quicken as they stepped inside. The air was colder here, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. In the center of the room stood an old desk, its surface cluttered with papers, a tarnished lamp, and a large wooden chest. The chest was locked, its edges worn with age, but it seemed out of place. Too deliberate, too untouched. Leo moved toward it, but Diana caught his arm. Wait, what if this is what he was hiding from? He glanced at her, his eyes dark. There's no turning back now. As Leo reached for the chest, the faintest whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable, came from the corner of the room. Don't open it. Diana froze. Leo's hand paused just inches from the lock. The room felt smaller, more oppressive, and the air grew colder still. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into complete darkness. And somewhere, deep within the mansion, something began to stir. The sudden slam of the door sent a shock through Diana's chest. Her breath caught in her throat, her eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. The air was thick, as though the room itself was holding something back. She could hear Leo's shallow breaths, his tension palpable. "Leo," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What was that?" He didn't answer. His hand still hovered over the chest, but his body had gone rigid. Diana could feel the weight of his gaze, the unease settling in between them like a fog. Then, without a word, Leo turned toward the door, his hand sliding along the wall in search of a way to reopen it. The silence grew heavier, thick with anticipation, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Diana strained to hear, but the only sound was the echo of their movements in the void. "Leo," she whispered again, more urgent this time. "Where are you going?" Leo froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" The whisper came again, clearer now, curling through the air like smoke, winding around their minds. It was a voice they both recognized. "Leave now." Diana felt a shiver crawl down her spine. Her heart raced, and for a moment, her feet felt rooted to the ground. "Julian," she breathed, the name escaping her lips before she could stop it. There was no answer, but the weight of the moment pressed in on her, as if the house itself had become a living, breathing entity, and it was watching them, waiting. Leo spun around, his eyes wide in the dark. What the hell is going on here? The hairs on the back of Diana's neck stood on end, the pulse of someone watching them. The air crackled with a tension that felt alive, suffocating them. She could feel it too now. Something in the room that wasn't human, something far older. There was a faint click, like a lock turning, coming from the far end of the room. Diana's pulse spiked. She turned quickly, but saw nothing in the darkness except the faint outline of the chest. Leo stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "I'm opening it." "No." Diana grabbed his arm, her fingers trembling as she held him back. "Don't." But it was too late. Leo had already moved toward the chest, his fingers brushing over the lock. The moment his hand touched the metal, a sharp, high-pitched screech echoed through the room, deafening in its intensity. It was the sound of metal grinding against metal, like a door opening into something much worse. The chest creaked open. Diana's breath hitched. The room felt like it was collapsing inward, the walls pressing in on them from all sides. She felt the weight of something unseen, something pressing against her chest, her lungs fighting for air. Inside the chest, nestled in a pile of old, brittle papers, lay a small, unmarked box. It was carved from dark wood, its surface smooth and cold to the touch, with intricate designs etched into its sides. But it was the symbol on top that made Diana's heart stop, an unfamiliar mark, a twisted knot that seemed to pulse, faintly glowing in the darkness. "Leo," her voice faltered, barely a whisper. "What is that?" Leo didn't answer. He reached for the box, his fingers trembling as he lifted it from the chest. The moment his hands made contact, a gust of wind surged through the room, extinguishing the faint light from their flashlights. The darkness pressed in tighter, the silence broken only by the beating of their hearts. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. It was a low rumble at first, then it grew, reverberating through the walls, the floor shaking with the force of it. Diana gasped, stumbling backward as the room seemed to shift, like the very foundation of the mansion was coming undone. The voice came again, louder this time, as though it was coming from the walls themselves, vibrating through the air. "You should not have opened it." Diana's head spun. Who is that?" she managed to choke out. But Leo wasn't listening. His eyes were wide, fixed on the box, which now pulsed with a sickly, greenish light. His fingers gripped it tighter, his knuckles white. "I don't know what's happening, but we need to leave. Now." Before Diana could react, the floor beneath their feet cracked open. A jagged gash split the stone, the ground trembling violently, as if the mansion was about to swallow them whole. The walls groaned, and the ceiling above them creaked ominously. Then the whisper returned, but this time it was not a whisper. It was a roar, deafening and filled with rage. "You are too late!" Diana screamed as the ground beneath her feet gave way. She felt herself falling into the darkness. Her hand shot out, grabbing Leo's arm in a desperate attempt to stop herself from plummeting into the unknown. But the force of the tremor was too strong. They were dragged, together, into the abyss. The world spun wildly, the darkness overwhelming. And then, everything went silent. The fall seemed endless, until it wasn't. Diana's body slammed hard against something cold and unforgiving. Pain shot through her, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The world around her was dark, silent. But then, from the depths of the shadowed void, came a single voice, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. "You should never have come." And somewhere far above, the house groaned as if alive, as though it knew something they didn't, something that had already begun. Diana's body ached, every inch of her senses screaming with disorientation. She could barely make sense of the blackness surrounding her, the damp, cold floor beneath her, and the suffocating silence that pressed in from all sides. Her head throbbed from the impact, but she forced herself to stay conscious, her breath shallow and ragged. She pushed herself up, feeling the weight of the darkness all around her, as though it were pressing against her from every direction. Her fingers brushed against cold stone, rough and jagged under her trembling hands. She pulled herself to her feet, her legs unsteady, her knees threatening to give out beneath her. "Leo!" Her voice cracked as she called out, her words swallowed by the suffocating dark. There was no answer, only the sound of her own breath and the distant, unsettling echo of something moving, something that shouldn't be there. She staggered forward, one hand outstretched, trying to find anything to ground her. Her eyes were useless in the blackness, but she could feel the air around her shifting. There was something in the atmosphere, something that made her skin crawl. "Leo!" She shouted again, more urgently this time. Her voice bounced off the walls, but still no answer came. Her pulse hammered in her ears as panic began to rise. The silence was oppressive, a living thing that seemed to grow with each passing second. She couldn't stay here. She needed to find Leo. She stumbled forward, her feet skimming over uneven ground. The air was damp, heavy, and the deeper she moved, the colder it became. She thought she heard a faint scrape, a shuffling noise, and her heart skipped in her chest. "Leo!" she whispered, more cautious now, as if afraid of drawing attention to herself. But as soon as she uttered his name, a low hum filled the space around her, so faint at first that she thought it was just her mind playing tricks. But it grew louder, stronger, resonating through her bones. The hum felt wrong, like a warning, an invitation to something sinister. She paused, trying to steady her breath, listening. The hum pulsed with a rhythmic consistency, almost like a heartbeat, but not human. The air thickened with a strange, metallic scent, like something old, something forgotten. The floor beneath her feet shifted. She felt it before she heard it, a groan, deep and unsettling, as though the earth itself was shifting. The humming stopped abruptly. Then came the footsteps. Slow at first, deliberate, but growing closer. the sound echoing in the dark like something stalking her from just out of sight. Diana froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and every muscle in her body tensed. She couldn't see who or what was there, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps were too measured, too purposeful to be Leo. She knew that with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty. A voice, gravelly, distorted, slithered through the darkness. "You shouldn't be here." The words were barely audible, but they sliced through the air, sending a jolt of terror through her body. Diana's heart raced. She spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the shadows swallowed everything. She was blind, trapped in a world where she couldn't even trust her own senses. She tried to move, to run, but the footsteps kept following, coming closer. They seemed to come from all directions, echoing off the walls, confusing her sense of space. She couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, couldn't tell if it was behind her, in front of her, or all around her. Panic clawed at her chest, but she forced herself to stay focused. The first rule: never let fear control you. But it was hard, so hard. The very air around her seemed to conspire against her, squeezing her lungs, making it harder to breathe. "Leo!" she screamed again, desperate. For a moment, the footsteps ceased. Silence pressed in, suffocating her. She held her breath, straining for any sound, any movement. But the dark was absolute. And then, just as quickly as the silence had come, the humming returned, louder than before, its rhythm matching the pounding of her heart. The ground beneath her feet began to shake again, this time violently, like the mansion itself was waking from a long slumber. Diana staggered, falling against the cold stone walls as the floor buckled beneath her. A crack ran through the ground, a deep fissure that seemed to open wide, stretching and splitting like the maw of some monstrous creature. She scrambled backward, her body screaming in protest, but the shaking only intensified. The wall beside her cracked, crumbling into dust, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. A low, guttural growl echoed from deep within the passage. The humming became a chorus now, overlapping with the growl, a discordant symphony that rattled her bones. It was the sound of something waking, something that should not have been disturbed. The growl grew louder, closer. Diana knew she had to move, had to make a choice. But her legs were frozen, rooted to the spot in fear. Whatever was in the passage, whatever had awakened, it wasn't meant for her. She could feel it, a sense of ancient malice, a presence that hungered. And then, she heard it, the sound of a door creaking open somewhere in the distance. The voice, distorted and warped, called to her again. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." She didn't need to be told twice. With every ounce of strength she could muster, she forced herself to her feet and ran toward the passageway. But as she reached the opening, something invisible, something unseen, slammed into her chest with the force of 100 hands. She was thrown back, crashing hard into the floor. Her vision swam, the darkness growing deeper, colder, more suffocating. And then, just as her body began to go numb, she felt it, a light, faint but undeniable, flickering in the distance. A hope, a possibility. She reached for it. And then, the world went black. Diana's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her was a blur, a haze of shadow and movement. Her head throbbed, a dull, pulsing ache that seemed to echo with the remnants of whatever force had thrown her to the ground. She struggled to sit up, her body heavy, as though every limb had been weighted down by something unseen. The faint light she had seen earlier was still there, distant and flickering like a dying ember. But now, it seemed far away, out of reach. She tried to push herself to her feet, but the ground was uneven, the stone beneath her shifting like the floor was alive. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if the air itself was pushing back against her. A faint rustling echoed from somewhere deeper in the passage. Her heart skipped a beat as her senses screamed at her to move, but her body wouldn't respond. The cold, metallic scent in the air was stronger now, clinging to the back of her throat as she breathed. The oppressive weight of the dark seemed to have thickened, like it was closing in around her. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her. Her hands reached for the wall, her fingers brushing the rough stone. A low hum filled the air again, distant, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable in its presence. The light flickered once more, like a beacon, but now it was no longer distant. It was closer, closer than it should have been. Diana's breath caught in her throat as she realized it was coming from deeper in the passage, not ahead of her. She had been wrong. The light wasn't a way out. It was drawing her in. Her heart raced as she took a step forward, the ground beneath her shifting with every movement. She couldn't stop herself, couldn't stop moving toward the source of the light. It was magnetic, pulling her in with an irresistible force. The rustling grew louder, more frantic. Then came the whispers again, not distant this time, but all around her, as though the very walls were speaking to her. Turn back, the voice rasped, barely a breath, but it held an edge of desperation. You're too close. Diana froze, the words chilling her to the core, but her body didn't stop moving. She couldn't stop it, as if the passage itself were guiding her, steering her toward the light, toward whatever lay at the end. The walls seemed to close in around her as the light grew brighter, casting sharp, flickering shadows along the passage. Her pulse raced, a surge of adrenaline pushing her forward even though every instinct screamed at her to run the other way. Another step, and then she heard it, the sound of something moving fast behind her, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Diana spun around, heart hammering in her chest, but there was nothing, just the same thick darkness swallowing everything. Leo, she called out, her voice barely a whisper. There was no answer, only the rustling, louder now, and the low hum vibrating through her chest. She couldn't stay here. Whatever was following her, whatever had been chasing her, was close. She spun back toward the light, now burning brighter, no longer a soft flicker, but a blinding glow that illuminated the far end of the passage. She pushed forward, forcing her legs to move, ignoring the cold sweat slicking down her back, the rising panic threatening to overtake her. And then she saw it, the source of the light, a door. Not a door she had passed before, but one that had suddenly materialized in front of her, its frame glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. It looked ancient, the wood warped and cracked, but there was no mistaking its significance. This was it, the way forward. The door was ajar, and through the small crack, Diana could see a sliver of what lay beyond, a room filled with shadows, with twisted shapes moving just beyond the threshold. Something was waiting. The rustling behind her intensified, the sound of footsteps now unmistakable, close, too close. Diana's breath quickened, her heart pounding louder than ever. She didn't want to go through the door. She didn't want to face whatever was waiting on the other side, but there was no other choice. With one final, shaky breath, she lunged toward the door, her hand grabbing the handle. But before she could push it open, the light behind her flickered. For a split second, the shadows seemed to grow, stretching toward her, as though something was reaching out to stop her. And then, from deep within the room, came a voice low, deep, almost a growl, but unmistakably clear. You've come too far. Diana recoiled, a chill running through her spine. The voice wasn't just a warning, it was a command, a threat. She could feel it, deep in her gut. Something was waiting for her beyond the door, and it was far worse than she had imagined. With one last glance over her shoulder, she slammed her shoulder into the door, pushing it open just wide enough to slip through. The room beyond was darker than the passageway, the air heavier with that metallic scent, and the walls, if they were walls, seemed to pulse, as though the very structure of the room was alive. Faint shapes moved in the shadows, but they were too indistinct to make out. But the most terrifying thing wasn't what she could see. It was what she could feel. The presence. It was close now, too close. She could sense it all around her. The weight of something ancient, something powerful that was beginning to stir. And then, as if the room itself had been waiting for her, the door slammed shut behind her with a force that rattled her bones. She was trapped. The light in the room flickered once more, illuminating something in the center of the space. A pedestal. On it lay an object, wrapped in cloth, its outline hidden in the shadows. but the sensation of wrongness was undeniable. Diana could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The presence, whatever it was closer now. So close that she could almost taste it. "Leave," the voice echoed, louder this time, coming from everywhere. It was no longer a warning. It was a command. And this time, Diana didn't doubt that it meant to be obeyed. But there was no way out. And she knew, deep down, that whatever was on the pedestal was the key. The key to the nightmare she was trapped in. And she had to make a choice. Diana's heart hammered against her chest as the room seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't explain. The air was thick, too thick, and the walls felt like they were closing in, slowly but relentlessly. Every instinct screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The door had slammed shut with a finality that left no doubt. She was trapped. Her eyes locked onto the pedestal in the center of the room, the cloth-wrapped object resting there, waiting. She didn't know why, but she could feel the pull of it, the magnetic tug that drew her in, despite the warning, despite the terror gnawing at her insides. The voice, now more insistent, echoed again in her mind, its tone sharp, cold, and filled with an unfathomable malice. "Do not touch it." Diana flinched, her skin crawling. The words weren't just a warning now. They felt like a promise of something far worse, something that awaited her if she made the wrong move. But there was something else, something she couldn't quite grasp, a sense that the room wasn't just alive with some malevolent force. It was responding to her. Every time she shifted, every time she breathed, the shadows seemed to shift with her, as if they were watching, reacting, anticipating her next move. She could feel the presence now, closer than ever, surrounding her from all sides. It was no longer a distant thing. It was in the very air, in the very walls. It was waiting for her to do something, anything. She turned her head to the far corner of the room, where a faint shimmer in the darkness caught her eye. It was almost imperceptible, just a flicker, but it was enough to make her blood run cold. Something, or someone, was watching her from that corner. She didn't dare look directly at it, but she knew it was there. She could feel its gaze, heavy and unblinking. Her breath hitched as a whispering sound filled the air, low and indistinct, like voices in another room, voices that weren't meant for her ears. And then the sound of movement, light but unmistakable, footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming closer. "Leo," she murmured, her voice shaky, her body frozen in place. She didn't know if he was somewhere in the room, or if she was imagining it, but the fear gnawing at her made it impossible to tell. The footsteps stopped, just behind her, as if someone, or something, was standing too close, waiting for her to turn around. The urge to reach for the object on the pedestal was overwhelming. She couldn't explain it, but it felt like the only way forward, like it was the only way to end whatever nightmare she had fallen into. But the voice that had warned her, that had grown louder with each passing moment, was right. She knew it was a trap. She knew whatever lay hidden beneath that cloth was not something she wanted to uncover. But the pull was undeniable, drawing her in, filling her mind with the terrible certainty that if she didn't act now, she would never get another chance. Her legs trembled, her feet rooted to the floor, unwilling to move. Every step she took seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds, her body fighting against her will. The footsteps stopped completely. The room was still. The only sound was her own breath, shallow and frantic, as she slowly turned toward the pedestal, her eyes locked on the cloth, the edges of it barely moving as the room seemed to hold its breath. The shadows cast by the flickering light shifted again, more erratically now, like they were twisting, warping, the darkness itself becoming more solid, more dangerous. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She couldn't stop herself. She reached out. The moment her fingers brushed the edge of the cloth, the room seemed to explode into motion. The ground beneath her feet shook violently, knocking her off balance, sending her crashing to the floor. The walls groaned, bending in unnatural ways, as if the very structure of the room was coming apart. She scrambled to her feet, gasping for air, the room spinning around her. The pedestal was no longer still. It was rocking back and forth, the object on it vibrating as though alive. the shadows around it writhing like something was trying to break free from beneath the cloth. And then, with a sickening rip, the cloth tore, and the object beneath it was revealed. It was a mirror, a simple, rectangular mirror, its surface cracked and warped, the edges jagged and twisted. But it wasn't just the mirror that held her attention. It was the reflection, or rather, the lack of one. Diana's heart froze in her chest. She wasn't looking into the mirror. She wasn't seeing her own reflection. Instead, she saw a shadow, a figure, standing just behind her in the reflection, its face obscured in the dark, but its outline unmistakable. Tall, imposing, with long, outstretched arms and a form that seemed to shift, as if it were constantly moving, stretching in and out of focus. The figure wasn't hers. It was someone or something else, and it was watching her. A rush of panic flooded her veins. She whirled around, but there was nothing behind her. No one. The room was empty, silent, save for the sound of her ragged breath. But when she turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. It was closer now, its form more defined, its face just a blur, but its presence undeniable. It was reaching out to her, its hand stretching toward the surface of the glass. And then, just as she thought it would pull her in, the figure spoke. "You should have left when you had the chance," it whispered, its voice like the grinding of metal, cold and guttural. Diana's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, staring in terror as the figure in the mirror raised its hand and slowly, deliberately, began to tap on the glass. The sound was faint at first, like a distant knock, but with every tap, it grew louder, more insistent, until, with one final, bone-shaking thud, the mirror cracked, its surface splitting wide open, and the figure reached out. And then everything went dark. The last thing Diana heard was the soft, breathless voice that seemed to come from everywhere. "Now you're ours." Diana's eyes snapped open, but the world around her was nothing but blackness. She wasn't sure if her mind was still caught in the whirlwind of the nightmare, or if she had truly fallen into some new reality. She was no longer in the room with the mirror. The air smelled stale, heavy with the sharp scent of dust and something else, something metallic. She blinked rapidly, trying to adjust to the darkness, but it didn't relent. It pressed in from all sides, suffocating. Her body was cold, the ground beneath her uneven and rough. She reached out instinctively, her hands brushing against stone. The sound of her breath was shallow, ragged. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been frozen in place. Where was she? The memory of the mirror flooded back in an instant. The tapping, the figure, that voice. The moment the darkness had swallowed her whole, she shuddered involuntarily, pushing herself to sit up, every instinct telling her to move, to run. But she had no idea where she was, or what was even real anymore. As her fingers found purchase on the cold stone beneath her, she realized there was something wrong with the ground, something beneath it. The texture felt strange, unnervingly slick. Her fingers slid over what seemed to be wetness, something damp and unnaturally cold. She recoiled, the sensation sending a wave of nausea through her. The darkness felt alive now, no longer passive but active, as if it were watching her, breathing with her. It seemed to grow thicker as she moved, pressing against her, tightening around her throat. She couldn't breathe properly. She needed to find her way out. But how? There was no way of knowing which direction to go. No sound, no guide, just the suffocating blackness that pressed in on her like a living, breathing thing. Then a soft, far-off scraping sound echoed through the void, faint at first, like the scurrying of something small and desperate. It stopped. Her heartbeat quickened. She wasn't alone. The realization hit her like a weight. There was something else here with her. She wasn't sure if it was human or something else entirely, but she wasn't alone. She strained her ears, trying to hear anything at all. There was silence, but the scraping had returned, louder now, closer. The cold dampness beneath her fingers seemed to pulse, almost like it was alive, contracting and expanding, moving in time with the scraping. She pulled her hand back and slowly tried to stand, her legs shaking with the effort, her mind screaming at her to move quickly. Her pulse thudded in her ears as she took her first steps, but the scraping followed. Step, scrape, step, scrape. It was no longer a faint sound in the distance. It was directly behind her. Diana's breath caught in her throat as the chill in the air deepened, swirling around her in tight circles. The darkness felt alive, closing in, drawing closer with every heartbeat. She didn't dare look behind her, but her every instinct screamed at her to run. She broke into a panicked sprint, her feet pounding against the stone floor, her hands scrambling against the walls, trying to find something to hold on to, something to anchor her. The darkness swallowed everything. The walls were slick with moisture, the stone too cold, the air too thick. She couldn't hear her own breathing anymore over the sound of the scraping, growing louder with each step she took. The walls began to feel as though they were moving, shifting, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. She had no sense of direction anymore, no way of telling if she was running in circles or if there was even an exit at all. The scraping had turned into something else now, something more deliberate, more focused, something that wanted her. The sensation of being hunted crawled up her spine. She rounded a corner, nearly tripping over her own feet, and then froze. At the end of the passage, there was a faint light, flickering erratically like a candle struggling to stay alight in the wind. It was a beacon. It was her only hope, but the scraping sound stopped. The air grew still, too still. It felt like the entire space had frozen. The tension and the darkness grew unbearable, suffocating, like she was being watched by something far older and far more dangerous than she could comprehend. Diana didn't move. She couldn't. She was stuck, trapped between the unknown danger lurking behind her and the distant flickering light that could be her escape or her doom. Her breath was ragged, every nerve in her body firing with the urgent need to act. Her mind screamed for her to run, to take the chance with the light, but every step felt impossible, like the floor was made of lead, keeping her rooted to the spot. And then, in the silence that hung thick in the air, she heard it, a low, guttural whisper, like the sound of something ancient, something that shouldn't exist. Run. The word came from behind her. It wasn't the voice of the figure in the mirror. It wasn't the voice of anyone she recognized. It was something darker, something much worse. It was a command, without thinking. Her legs moved. She ran. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel it. Whatever was following her, whatever had been lurking in the darkness, was closing in. The light flickered once more, growing brighter, and with a surge of adrenaline, she pushed herself faster, her feet pounding against the ground. The walls, the air, the very stone beneath her feet seemed to shift with every step she took, but she couldn't stop. The light was so close now, and yet the sound of scraping feet was louder than ever. She was almost there, and then, just as her fingers brushed against the light, she heard a voice, one she recognized. Diana. It was Leo's voice. She stopped in her tracks, her heart slamming in her chest. She whipped around, but there was no sign of him. Nothing. Her mind was spinning, her body trembling from the fear and the exhaustion. The light in front of her flickered once more, and the air grew heavier, like it was pushing back against her. And then, in the shadows, she saw a figure. Not Leo, but someone else, someone taller, with long, outstretched arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally long in the dark. The figure's face was hidden in the shadows, but Diana could feel its gaze, cold, unblinking, and full of malice. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command. You should have stayed in the dark. Diana's heart stopped, the words echoing through her mind like an ominous drumbeat. Her breath hitched as the figure in the darkness slowly, deliberately, began to move toward her. Its silhouette stretched unnaturally, as if it were both here and not here, a thing that didn't belong, but that was determined to claim its place. She wanted to scream, but the air had thickened, suffocating her words before they could escape. Her chest tightened with each breath, and her legs trembled, unable to push her forward. She was rooted to the spot, like prey waiting for a predator to close in. The figure stopped, standing perfectly still, its presence suffocating the space around her. Diana could feel its gaze on her, even though she couldn't see its face. The air was heavy with the feeling of something ancient, something that had waited far too long for this moment. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the terror flooding her veins. What was it? What did it want with her? Then the figure stepped forward again, its feet making no sound on the stone floor. Each movement was slow and deliberate, as though it were savoring the moment. Diana backed away, her eyes darting to the dim light ahead of her. It was her only chance. She had to get there. But every step she took away from the figure felt like a 1,000-pound weight holding her back. It was closer now. She could feel the shift in the air, the pressure mounting, pushing her toward the dark, toward the thing that waited. Run, the voice said again. But this time it was a command laced with mockery, a twisted kind of amusement. Run, little girl. See how far you can go. The words sent a chill through her bones. There was no way to outrun it. She knew that. The more she tried to move, the more the darkness seemed to wrap around her, pulling her back into its grip. Suddenly, there was a sound, a sharp, crackling noise, followed by the unmistakable feeling of something shifting in the air. It was as if the very fabric of the space around her was warping, bending, like it had a life of its own. The shadows twisted and stretched, reaching for her, pulling her closer to the figure. Diana gasped, her eyes wide, but her feet refused to move. The light ahead, so close now, seemed to flicker one last time, then began to fade, retreating into the blackness like a dying star. The figure was nearly upon her. She could feel its presence, a weight on her chest, suffocating, and she knew, deep down, that if it touched her, she wouldn't survive. Her mind was reeling, thoughts crashing together. But there was only one thing she knew with absolute certainty. She had to get to the light. It was her only hope. Without thinking, her body surged forward. She threw herself toward the light, her hands outstretched, her fingers grazing the edge of the glow. But the instant she made contact, something shot through her. A searing pain lanced through her chest, like fire and ice all at once, and she screamed, stumbling backward. The light flickered violently, as if struggling against an unseen force. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. The room plunged into deeper darkness than before, and the temperature seemed to drop, the air turning thick and heavy. Diana gasped, her breath coming in ragged, panic gasps. She wasn't sure what had just happened, what she had touched, but it had felt wrong, like the light itself had rejected her. The figure was still there. She could feel it, closer now, so close that she could hear its breath, low and slow, just behind her. Why did you touch it? The voice whispered again, this time with a venomous edge. You should have known better. Diana's eyes darted around the room in desperation. She couldn't see anything, just the deep, suffocating black. Her mind screamed for her to run. But where? Every direction felt like the wrong one. Every step, every breath, only seemed to drag her deeper into the nightmare. Her hand brushed against something cold, slick, and she recoiled instinctively. The surface beneath her was no longer solid. She was standing on something wet, slippery. The scraping sound began again, but this time it was joined by something else, a low, almost guttural growl, coming from the depths of the darkness. It was no longer just the sound of footsteps. It was something else, something animalistic, primal, something that was hungry. She turned, but there was nothing to see. The growl grew louder, and then a sharp crack echoed through the room, like something snapping, breaking. Diana's breath caught in her throat as she heard it. Whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that came from all around her, from the very walls themselves. They were calling to her, pulling her in. And just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the floor beneath her feet shifted again, this time, violently. With a screeching sound, the ground cracked open, a dark abyss yawning before her. Her legs buckled, and she stumbled forward, barely managing to catch herself against the jagged edge of the new chasm. The whispers grew louder, 1,000 voices all at once, speaking over each other, growing frantic, desperate. It was no longer just the figure in the dark that threatened her. It was everything. The room, the air, the ground beneath her feet. Everything was shifting, warping, turning against her. And then, in the middle of it all, she heard it, a voice crystal clear, but colder than anything she had ever heard before. "You should never have come here, Diana." The ground trembled beneath her. The walls groaned, the sound like the crack of thunder. And then the abyss began to widen, and Diana knew, with a terrible certainty, that if she fell, she wouldn't just disappear into the darkness. She would become a part of it, forever. Diana's fingers dug into the jagged edge of the chasm, her nails scraping against the stone, but the ground continued to tremble beneath her, as if it were alive, as if it were trying to swallow her whole. The voices, those whispers, grew louder still, each one clawing at her sanity, pressing against her skull, making her head throb. Her breath came in ragged gasps, panic overtaking her senses. She couldn't hold on much longer. The darkness was closing in, the weight of it pressed on her chest, suffocating her, and the growling, the scraping, the whispers, they were all part of it now, part of the thing that hunted her. She could feel it, that terrible presence, pulling at her from all sides. The abyss before her widened further, the shadows deeper than anything she had ever seen. And in the heart of the darkness, she saw them, shapes moving, shifting, undulating like creatures from a nightmare. They weren't human, but they were so much worse. They were not bound by any rules Diana understood. They had no form, no face, just the gleaming, hateful eyes that stared back at her, glowing faintly in the dark. "Diana," the voice again, this time closer. It sounded like ice scraping against stone. It wasn't the figure she had seen before. This voice felt different. It knew her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head furiously. She couldn't afford to let herself believe it. Not now. She had to stay focused. She had to fight. She looked up, but the light was gone. There was nothing left but the thick, suffocating blackness and the creatures that watched her, circling like vultures. "Asterisk no, asterisk," she repeated, her hands trembling. Her strength was waning, and each breath felt like it could be her last. The abyss below her yawned wider, as if the ground itself was taunting her, daring her to fall into its depths. And then she realized something. The whispers, the growls, the shifting ground, they weren't just happening around her. They were happening inside her too. Her own body felt alien, like it no longer belonged to her. The skin on her arms prickled with the sensation of something crawling beneath it, something that was trying to break free. "Run!" Leo's voice sliced through the chaos, a sudden surge of clarity in the storm of madness. Diana looked up, her heart racing. She hadn't heard Leo's voice since the mirror. How could he? And then she saw him, not standing beside her, but hovering just beyond the edge of the chasm. His form was vague, almost translucent, as if the shadows themselves were swallowing him whole. But his eyes, they were unmistakable, those familiar, warm eyes. He was fading. "Leo," she called out, her voice shaking. He didn't answer, only looked at her with those eyes that burned with an intensity she had never seen before. It was as though he was seeing her for the first time, and the look in his eyes was filled with something far darker than fear. It was regret. It was pain. "No, Leo, don't go. Please." But his form continued to flicker, the shadows pulling him back, deeper into the void. She reached out, her hands trembling as if they could grasp him from this distance. But the closer she got, the farther away he seemed. Her body screamed for her to jump, to chase after him. But she knew. She knew. Whatever that thing was, whatever this place had become, Leo wasn't the one she was supposed to save. The air grew colder, the whispers turning into a low, menacing chant. The creatures in the dark were moving again, their forms beginning to solidify, materializing from the blackness in a grotesque wave of shifting limbs and eyes. Their eyes gleamed, hungry and unblinking, and Diana knew they were coming for her. She was the prey, and the hunter was drawing closer. But the worst part wasn't the creatures, or even the darkness. It was the weight of realization settling on her like a stone. This wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. The mirror, the whispers, the impossible darkness. It had all been a trap, a carefully laid one, and she had walked right into it. No, she gasped, the truth sinking into her bones. This is what I was meant to find. This was what I was supposed to become. The creatures paused, as if they had heard her. Their glowing eyes flickered in unison, and a low, eerie hum echoed around her. Something about it made her skin crawl, made her bones feel like they were turning to ice. Suddenly, a voice, the same one that had whispered to her earlier, spoke directly into her mind. It wasn't like before, distant and hollow. Now it was inside her, wrapping around her thoughts, gripping her chest with an icy hand. Asterisk, you have always known asterisk. Diana's head spun, the darkness swirling around her, becoming more than just her surroundings. It was in her now, threading its way through her veins, poisoning her thoughts, changing her. She could feel it. She could feel herself becoming it. Asterisk, we are waiting for you, asterisk. The shadows shifted violently. The creatures surged forward, their grotesque forms pulling her toward the abyss. The force of their movement was too powerful, and Diana's fingers slipped from the edge of the chasm. She fell, her body twisted as she plummeted into the blackness, her screams swallowed by the void. And then, just as the darkness was about to consume her entirely, she felt something. Something that cut through the cold like a blade, the faintest trace of warmth. It was Leo's voice again, a whisper in the chaos. Diana, her heart froze. The warmth she had felt was gone in an instant, and she was back in the darkness, tumbling toward an unknown fate. The shadows closed in, and then everything went still. For a moment, it was as though time itself had stopped. The creatures, the voices, the cold, the chaos, they were all gone. But she wasn't alone. There in the dark, she could feel something or someone watching her. The figure stepped forward again, emerging from the shadows. Not a monstrous, twisting thing, but something that was almost human. It wasn't Leo, but it was waiting for her. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The one thing she'd been running from wasn't the dark. It was what she was becoming. The figure before Diana was tall, its form outlined against the depths of the abyss, its features barely distinguishable in the gloom. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like the creatures from before either. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, something that made her pulse quicken, a sinking feeling clawing at her chest. The figure took a slow step forward, its movement unnaturally smooth, like a shadow bending in the light. Diana could feel the air growing colder around her, the pressure mounting with every inch it closed toward her. You, she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to steady it. What are you? The figure said nothing, but its presence seemed to pull the very air from her lungs. It wasn't the silence of nothing. It was the silence of everything, a weight that pressed against her mind, bending it, warping it, forcing her to confront the very truth she had been running from. It was then that she realized this thing wasn't just a monster. It wasn't just a shadow in the dark. It was her, or at least part of her. The realization hit her like a crushing wave, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, what was happening to her. The darkness, the whispers, the creatures. It had all been leading to this moment, to this confrontation. She wasn't just trapped in some twisted nightmare. She was being confronted by something far worse, a part of herself, twisted and broken. I was waiting for you. The figure finally spoke, its voice low and steady, like a dark melody. It was her voice, but warped, unfamiliar, cold. Did you think you could run from what you are? Diana's chest tightened. She took a step back, her mind reeling. No, this can't be. You have always known. The figure continued, its voice echoing around her, reverberating in her bones. You knew from the moment you stepped into this place. You knew you would find me here. You knew you would become me. Stop! Diana shouted, her hands trembling at her sides. I'm nothing like you. The figure's lips curled into a smile, a cruel, knowing smile. You think you can fight me? You think you can escape what you are? You can't. I am the part of you that you've buried, the part of you that you deny. I am the one you were always meant to become. The ground beneath her feet trembled once again, but this time, it wasn't the chasm that was threatening to swallow her. It was her own mind, her own body. She could feel it. Something was changing. The shadows seemed to bleed into her, suffusing her limbs, flooding her veins. The coldness of the darkness seeped into her bones, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost see it. The part of herself she had tried so desperately to ignore, to lock away. Her breath quickened, her chest tightening. The darkness was no longer just outside her. It was in her. She could feel it clawing its way into her thoughts, into her very soul. "You are mine," the figure murmured, its voice almost a lullaby now. "And you will always be mine." "No," Diana gasped, trying to fight it, trying to push back against the suffocating weight of the darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. She didn't want to become this. She didn't want to become a part of whatever this was. She wasn't evil. She wasn't twisted. She was Diana. She was more than this. But the shadows pushed back harder, pulling at her, tearing at her mind, at her will. She could hear the growls again, the scraping, the whispers, all of them inside her now. Her heart pounded in her chest, the pain of it almost unbearable. "Do you feel it?" the figure asked, its voice taunting, cruel. "Do you feel the truth coursing through your veins? You cannot escape this. You can only embrace it." Diana squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sounds, the darkness, the figure. But it was no use. It was everywhere. It was inside her. And the worst part was, she could feel it. Something inside her wanted to give in, wanted to accept it, to become it. Her hands shook violently. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on. Her strength was fading, her mind unraveling, and she could feel herself slipping into the abyss, becoming part of the darkness that was waiting for her. And then, through the chaos, through the darkness and the whispers, a new voice, faint but distinct, cut through the madness. Diana, her heart skipped a beat. It was Leo's voice, clear as day, but somehow distant, like a dream slipping away, just as she was about to reach for it. "Leo," she whispered, her voice raw, but there was no answer. The figure in front of her stepped closer, its form now so near that she could feel the cold radiating off of it, seeping into her skin. "You cannot run from what you are. You cannot run from me." "I won't be you," Diana whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. But the figure's smile only deepened darker. "You already are." The ground beneath her feet cracked with a deafening roar, and before Diana could react, the floor gave way, plunging her into the endless void below. As she fell, she felt herself being pulled toward something dark and powerful, something that wanted to claim her, to consume her. And then, just as her body was about to be swallowed by the abyss, a flash of light flared from nowhere. Leo's voice again, urgent, "Diana now." For a split second, the darkness faltered, as if it had been struck by a force it couldn't control. And in that moment of hesitation, Diana reached out with everything she had, pushing against the pull, against the suffocating grip of the shadows. The light was flickering, but it was there, and it was her only chance. Diana's body twisted midair, the pull of the shadows still fierce, but the light, Leo's light, was stronger now, burning through the darkness that had tried to consume her. She reached out, desperate, fingers grazing the edge of something warm, something alive. With a force she didn't know she had left, she gripped it tightly, and the light flared brighter, pushing the shadows back, shattering the cold, suffocating weight around her. She felt the darkness rippling as it retreated, its hold on her slipping away. For a moment, everything was still. The void around her had vanished, replaced by the soft glow of light. And the creatures, the whispers, the figure, all of it had disappeared. She was safe. Diana opened her eyes to find herself standing in a quiet, familiar place, an empty room, bathed in the golden light of a setting sun. The warmth of the light was gentle, comforting. She looked down at her hands. They were steady now, not trembling, not cold. There was no darkness, no shadow. She took a deep breath, the weight that had pressed on her for so long lifting from her chest. And then she saw him, Leo, standing just a few feet away, his expression soft, relieved. "Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're here." He smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "I'm always here, Diana. You just needed to find me." Diana stepped toward him, her heart swelling with relief. "I almost didn't make it," she admitted, her voice shaky. "I almost let it take me." Leo's hand reached out, touching hers gently. "But you didn't. You found your way through. You're stronger than you think." Diana looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt at peace. The darkness was gone, but more than that, she understood now. She wasn't just a survivor of what had happened. She was more. She was free. Leo's voice broke through her thoughts, his smile widening. "You'll always have to fight, Diana, but you're not alone anymore." With that, everything faded into light. The room dissolved, the shadows cleared, and the world around her brightened. She felt lighter than ever before, the weight of uncertainty and fear gone. She was ready for whatever came next, knowing she had the strength to face it. As the light enveloped her completely, the soft sound of footsteps echoed around her, warm, familiar, and unwavering. And with that, Diana knew her journey had ended, but her story had only just begun. Thank you for reading this thrilling adventure. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and follow us for more exciting tales and heart-pounding moments. Stay tuned for the next chapter in our journey. There's always more to discover.